In the heart of New York City, where glass towers meet cobblestone streets and the scent of espresso mingles with exhaust fumes, there existed a world most people never saw. Behind the glittering restaurants of Little Italy, beneath the polished surface of legitimate businesses, a darker empire thrived. And at its center stood one man, Lorenzo De Luca. Lorenzo wasn't just feared. He was a legend whispered about in basement poker games and corner delis. A man whose very name could end conversations, whose shadow stretched across 5 boroughs. He controlled everything from the docks of Brooklyn to the luxury penthouses of Manhattan. Politicians answered his calls. Businessmen trembled at his requests. And those who crossed him, they simply disappeared. But this isn't a story about Lorenzo De Luca. This is a story about Isabella Rossi, the woman who would bring his empire to its knees. Isabella had come into Lorenzo's life 7 years ago, during a cold November evening when rain painted the streets silver, and the city felt like it was holding its breath. She was 23 then, working as a translator at a charity gala in the Upper East Side. Lorenzo had been there as a philanthropist, his public mask carefully constructed, his $3,000 suit perfectly tailored, his smile calculated to charm. He noticed her immediately, not because of her beauty, though she was striking with her dark hair and intelligent eyes. No, Lorenzo noticed her because she was the only person in that room who looked at him without either fear or admiration. She looked at him with simple curiosity, as if he were just another man. That night, he approached her. He spoke in smooth Italian, testing her skills. She responded flawlessly, her translations precise, her voice steady. He was intrigued. She was competent, educated, and completely unaware of who he really was. Within 2 months, she was working for him. Within 6, she had seen too much to ever leave. The transformation had been gradual, like winter slowly claiming autumn. At first, the job seemed perfect. Isabella translated documents, facilitated meetings with international associates, attended dinners where deals were made over expensive wine and laughter. She was paid generously. Lorenzo was always respectful, almost gentlemanly. She told herself she was simply working for a successful businessman with complicated international interests. But the truth revealed itself in fragments. A conversation that ended abruptly when she entered a room. Blood on a shirt cuff that Lorenzo casually changed before a meeting. The way men's voices dropped to whispers when she approached. The bruises on the face of a man who had supposedly retired from Lorenzo's organization. The night she understood everything, she had worked late at Lorenzo's office, a converted warehouse in Red Hook with views of the Statue of Liberty. She had been translating a contract when she heard shouting from the floor below. Lorenzo's voice, cold and controlled. Another man pleading. The sound of impact. Then silence. Isabella had frozen at her desk, her hands trembling over the keyboard, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain someone would hear it. When Lorenzo returned 30 minutes later, his shirt was different, but his demeanor was unchanged. He smiled at her, asked if she needed anything, and told her to go home early. She never asked what happened. She learned not to ask questions. Over the years, Isabella became something between an employee and a possession. Lorenzo never touched her inappropriately. He was too calculating for that, but he controlled her nonetheless. He decided where she lived, moving her into a luxury apartment he owned in Greenwich Village. He monitored her friendships, subtly discouraging relationships that might take her away from his orbit. He paid her too well to leave, but made it clear that leaving wasn't an option anyway. "You know too much now," he had told her once, his voice gentle but his eyes hard as stone. "You're family, Isabella, and family stays loyal." The threat was never spoken aloud, but it hung in the air between them like smoke. Isabella had seen what happened to those who betrayed Lorenzo De Luca. She had translated the police reports, heard the rumors, watched the news broadcasts about bodies found in dumpsters or floating in the East River. So she stayed silent. She did her work. She attended the dinners and the meetings. She translated the words that sealed fates and moved millions. And slowly, year by year, she felt herself disappearing. The person she had been replaced by someone who knew how to survive in Lorenzo's shadow. The New York seasons changed around her like a carousel she couldn't escape. Summers humid and suffocating. Autumns crisp with false promise. Winters that froze her from the inside out. Springs that never quite delivered their hope. She watched from her apartment window as other people lived their lives. Couples laughing in Washington Square Park. Friends gathering at outdoor cafes. students rushing to classes with futures still bright and possible. Isabella had stopped believing in futures. She had learned to read Lorenzo's moods like others read weather forecasts. The slight tightening of his jaw that meant someone had disappointed him, the cold smile that preceded violence, the way his fingers drummed on tables when he was planning something that would change lives forever. She had become an expert in survival, in making herself useful but invisible, in never asking the questions whose answers might destroy her. But fear has a peculiar quality. Live with it long enough and it becomes familiar, almost comfortable in its predictability. Isabella had built her entire existence around avoiding Lorenzo's anger, around staying in his good graces, around being too valuable to harm but not valuable enough to threaten. She had forgotten what it felt like to be brave, until the night everything changed. It started with small tremors in Lorenzo's empire, barely noticeable at first, like distant thunder on a summer evening. A shipment seized at the port, an associate arrested unexpectedly, rumors of an informant embedded deep within the organization. Lorenzo's meetings became longer, his mood darker, his patience thinner. Isabella felt it in the atmosphere, the way animals sense earthquakes before they strike. Something was coming, something that would shake the very foundations of the world she had learned to navigate. She just didn't know that when it arrived, she would be the one standing at its center. March arrived in New York with the kind of cold that cuts through expensive coats and reaches bone. The city seemed grayer than usual, as if even the weather knew something terrible was brewing. For Isabella Rossi, the change in Lorenzo's empire wasn't just noticeable, it was suffocating. The FBI had been building their case for 3 years. Isabella didn't know this, of course. Neither did Lorenzo, not fully. But the signs were everywhere for those who knew how to look. Federal agents had flipped Marco Benedetti, Lorenzo's second-in-command, a man who had been with him for 15 years. They had recordings, photographs, financial documents that traced money through shell companies and offshore accounts. They had testimonies from smaller operators who had chosen cooperation over prison time. They were building a case that would dismantle the DeLuca organization piece by piece. The first major blow came on a Tuesday evening. Lorenzo's nephew, Anthony, was arrested outside a restaurant in Queens. The charges were extensive: racketeering, money laundering, conspiracy to commit murder. The arraignment was all over the news. Isabella watched it on her apartment television, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago, her stomach twisted into knots. Lorenzo didn't rage when he heard. That would have been almost comforting in its familiarity. Instead, he went silent, a terrifying, calculating silence that meant he was thinking, planning, deciding who had betrayed him and how they would pay. Isabella was summoned to his office the next morning. The warehouse in Red Hook had always felt imposing, but that day it felt like a tomb. The security was doubled, men with hard eyes and concealed weapons standing at every entrance. The atmosphere was thick with suspicion and barely contained violence. Lorenzo sat behind his massive desk, the windows behind him showing the gray expanse of New York Harbor. He looked older than Isabella had ever seen him, the lines around his eyes deeper, his jaw tight with stress. But his eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, were as sharp as ever. He didn't ask her to sit. "I need you to translate something for me," he said, his voice flat, emotionless. He slid a folder across the desk toward her. "These are intercepted communications from our associates in Naples. Someone has been talking to law enforcement. I need to know who." Isabella's hands trembled slightly as she opened the folder. The documents were in Italian, technical and coded, the kind of communications she had translated 100 times before. But this time was different. This time she was helping Lorenzo hunt for the person who was trying to bring him down. This time she wasn't sure which side she wanted to win. She worked for hours that day, translating, cross-referencing, feeling the weight of each word like stones being placed on her chest. Around her, Lorenzo's world was collapsing in slow motion. His phone rang constantly. Associates arrived looking worried, left looking terrified. Shipments were being intercepted. Bank accounts were being frozen. The walls were closing in. And through it all, Lorenzo remained controlled, methodical, dangerous. Over the next 2 weeks, Isabella watched the empire crumble. Vincent Morello, Lorenzo's oldest friend and the man who controlled operations in New Jersey, was arrested at his daughter's wedding. The indictment was devastating. 23 counts, enough to put him away for life. Photos from the arrest spread across every news outlet. Vincent in his tuxedo, hands cuffed behind his back, his daughter crying in her wedding dress as federal agents led her father away. Lorenzo didn't attend the funeral for Vincent's reputation. He was too busy trying to save his own. Then came the discovery that shattered everything. Marco Benedetti, the man Lorenzo had trusted above all others, had been wearing a wire for 18 months. Every conversation, every meeting, every order Lorenzo had given had been recorded and delivered to the FBI. The night Lorenzo found out, Isabella was working late, as she often did now. Anything to delay returning to her apartment where the walls seemed to close in on her, where she lay awake wondering how much longer she could survive in this dying empire. She heard the explosion of rage from 3 floors below. Glass shattering, furniture overturning. Lorenzo's voice, usually so controlled, screaming obscenities in Italian. The sound of impact, fist against wall, body against floor, she couldn't tell. She sat frozen at her desk, barely breathing, waiting for the violence to either pass or reach her. When Lorenzo finally climbed the stairs to her office, his right hand was bleeding. His knuckles split open. His face was a mask of cold fury that made her blood freeze. He looked at her for a long moment, and Isabella saw something she had never seen before in Lorenzo De Luca's eyes. Fear. Not fear of the consequences. Fear of losing control. Fear that the empire he had built with blood and intimidation was slipping through his fingers like water. "They're coming for me," he said quietly, almost conversationally, as if discussing the weather. "The raids will happen within days, maybe hours." Isabella said nothing. What could she say? That she was sorry? That she hoped he'd escape? Both would have been lies. Lorenzo walked to the window, his bloodied hand leaving a smear on the glass as he looked out at the city he had once controlled. "I've made arrangements," he continued. "Money in places they can't touch. Contacts who will help me disappear if necessary. I've survived worse than this." But his voice lacked conviction, and they both knew it. He turned to look at her again, and this time his gaze was different, assessing, calculating. "You've been loyal, Isabella. All these years you've never betrayed me, never asked questions, never created problems. It wasn't praise. It was a reminder of her complicity. I'll need you in the coming days," he said. "When this is over, when I've dealt with the traitors and reminded this city who I am, I'll remember those who stood by me." The threat was implicit. Stand by him, or become another casualty of his survival. Isabella nodded slowly, her throat too tight for words. The raids came 3 days later at dawn when the city was just beginning to wake. Federal agents swarmed Lorenzo's properties simultaneously. The warehouse in Red Hook, his penthouse in Manhattan, his social club in Little Italy, the restaurant in Queens that served as a front for his operations. Isabella was at her apartment when her phone rang. It was Lorenzo, his voice tight with barely controlled panic, giving her instructions to destroy certain documents, to move money, to contact specific lawyers. She listened, wrote everything down, and then sat staring at the notes in her handwriting. This was her moment. She could do what he asked and remain complicit, or she could do nothing and let the empire finally fall. But fear was still stronger than courage. She had lived under Lorenzo's control for so long that defiance seemed impossible. She spent the next 12 hours following his instructions, destroying evidence, making calls, playing her part in his desperate attempt to avoid justice. By nightfall, Lorenzo had evaded immediate arrest, but his organization was in ruins. The FBI had seized millions in assets. Over 30 associates had been arrested. The news showed footage of men being led away in handcuffs, of warehouses being searched, of the empire being dismantled piece by piece, and Isabella returned to her apartment exhausted and hollow, wondering how much longer she could live in this nightmare before it consumed her completely. She stood at her window looking out at Greenwich Village below. The streets were alive with people living their lives, laughing, arguing, loving, being free. She had forgotten what freedom felt like. She had forgotten what it meant to make choices that were truly her own. That night, for the first time in 7 years, Isabella Rossi allowed herself to imagine a different life. One where Lorenzo De Luca didn't control her every move. One where she wasn't defined by fear. She didn't know that within 48 hours, she would be forced to choose between that life and her survival. The abandoned warehouse in Brooklyn stood like a monument to Lorenzo's fallen empire. Once bustling with activity and power, it now sat dark and cold, its windows broken, its walls covered in shadows. The March wind howled through the empty spaces, carrying with it the scent of rain and rust. This was where Lorenzo De Luca had called Isabella for their final meeting. The call had come at 2 in the morning, jolting her from restless sleep. Lorenzo's voice had been different, stripped of its usual control, edged with something desperate and dangerous. He needed her one more time. There were documents to translate, he said. Emergency funds to access. Final arrangements to make before he disappeared. Isabella had almost said no. She had lain in her bed, phone pressed to her ear, and felt the words forming. I can't do this anymore. I won't. But fear was still there, coiled in her chest like a snake. Fear of what Lorenzo could still do, even in his diminished state. Fear of the men who still remained loyal to him. Fear that had been her constant companion for 7 years. So she had said yes. One more time. Now, as she stepped out of the taxi 3 blocks away, she had learned long ago not to let drivers know her exact destination, and walked through the empty Brooklyn streets toward the warehouse. Isabella felt something shifting inside her. The fear was still there, but it was being crowded by something else. Exhaustion. Soul-deep weariness with living in constant terror. She was tired of being afraid. The warehouse door was slightly ajar, a rectangle of dim light spilling onto the cracked pavement. Isabella paused at the threshold, her hand on the cold metal, her heart hammering. Every instinct screamed at her to turn around, to run, to disappear into the city and never look back. But she had spent 7 years being obedient, 7 years being controlled, 7 years being someone she barely recognized. She stepped inside. The main floor was nearly empty, stripped of the equipment and goods that had once filled it. A single light hung from the ceiling, swaying slightly in the draft, casting moving shadows across the concrete floor. And there, in the center of that circle of light, stood Lorenzo De Luca. He looked like a ghost of himself. His expensive suit was rumpled, his tie loosened, his usually perfect hair disheveled. But it was his eyes that shocked her. They were wild, desperate, the eyes of a man who had lost everything and was clinging to the last fragments of his power. He wasn't alone. 3 men stood in the shadows behind him. Tony Russo, James Chen, and Carlo Vetti, the last loyal soldiers of a fallen empire. Isabella recognized them all. She had seen them at meetings, had translated their conversations, had witnessed their violence. Isabella, Lorenzo said, and his voice was almost gentle. Almost. Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would. She stepped further into the warehouse, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. You said you needed my help. I do. Lorenzo gestured to a table where papers were scattered. These documents, they're access codes to accounts in the Cayman Islands. Funds I've kept separate from the main operations. Clean money, untraceable. But the instructions are in Italian banking code. I need you to translate them so I can access the funds and disappear before the final indictments come down. Isabella looked at the documents, then back at Lorenzo. This was it. The last thread connecting her to his world. Translate these documents, and she would be complicit one final time in helping a criminal escape justice. Refuse, and she would finally break free. But breaking free came with consequences. Lorenzo, she said slowly, I can't do this anymore. The warehouse went silent except for the wind whistling through broken windows. Lorenzo's expression didn't change immediately, but Isabella saw something shift in his eyes. Surprise, then calculation, then cold anger. Can't, he repeated softly. Or won't. Both. Isabella's voice was steadier than she expected. I'm done. I'm done translating documents for you. I'm done being part of this. I'm done being afraid. One of the men behind Lorenzo, Tony Russo, laughed, a harsh bark of sound. You're done? You don't get to be done, sweetheart. You're in this as deep as the rest of us. But Lorenzo raised his hand, silencing him. His gaze never left Isabella's face. You forget who you're talking to. You forget what I can do. And there it was. The threat. The reminder of his power. Even in ruins. Isabella felt the familiar fear rising. The instinct to apologize, to comply, to survive. But she thought of 7 years of silence. 7 years of complicity. 7 years of watching herself disappear piece by piece. She thought of Marco Benedetti, who had found the courage to betray Lorenzo and bring down his empire. She thought of all the people who had suffered because of this man's greed and violence. She thought of the woman she used to be, before fear consumed her. No, Isabella said quietly. I don't forget. I remember everything, every threat, Every warning. Every time you made me feel like I was nothing more than your property. I remember all of it. Lorenzo took a step toward her, his face darkening. You ungrateful. I remember translating the orders that got people killed. Isabella continued, her voice growing stronger. I remember the documents that helped you steal and intimidate and destroy. I remember being so afraid that I couldn't sleep, couldn't breathe, couldn't imagine any life outside of serving you. Careful, Isabella. Lorenzo's voice was ice. You're walking a very dangerous line. Behind him, the three men shifted, their body language turning predatory. Isabella saw Carlo Vetti's hand move toward his jacket, where she knew he kept a gun. This was the moment, the point of no return. Isabella looked at Lorenzo De Luca, this man who had controlled her life for 7 years, who had made her forget who she was, who had wielded fear like a weapon, and she felt something crack inside her. Not breaking, cracking open, letting light in. You're right, she said, and her voice didn't shake. I am walking a dangerous line. But you know what, Lorenzo? I'm not afraid of you anymore. The words hung in the air like a gunshot. Lorenzo stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief. Around them, the warehouse seemed to hold its breath. This was something that didn't happen in Lorenzo De Luca's world. People didn't stand up to him. They didn't defy him. They certainly didn't tell him they weren't afraid. You're making a mistake, Lorenzo said, his voice low and dangerous. A fatal mistake. Maybe, Isabella replied. But it's my mistake to make. For 7 years you've controlled my life. You've controlled my choices. You've made me afraid to even think about freedom. But your empire is gone, Lorenzo. The FBI is closing in. Your men are in prison or turning on you. You have nothing left except your threats, and I'm done letting those threats control me. Lorenzo's face flushed with rage. He took another step toward her, and for a moment Isabella thought he might actually strike her. Behind him, Carlo's hand was definitely on his weapon now. But then something unexpected happened. Lorenzo stopped. He stood there staring at her, and Isabella saw something she had never seen before in his eyes. Recognition. Not respect exactly, but something close to it. The recognition that she had changed. That the woman standing before him was not the same terrified translator he had controlled for 7 years. You think you can just walk away? He asked. But there was less certainty in his voice now. I think I already have, Isabella said. For a long moment they stood there, locked in a battle of wills that had been building for 7 years. The fear was still there, screaming at Isabella to run, to apologize, to submit. But something stronger held her in place. The realization that if she backed down now, she would never be free. She would spend the rest of her life running from Lorenzo's shadow. Lorenzo seemed to come to a decision. His expression hardened and he nodded slowly. Tony, Carlo, take her to the back room. Make sure she understands the consequences of betrayal. The two men moved forward, their intentions clear. And that's when the doors burst open. Federal agents poured into the warehouse like a flood, their weapons drawn, their voices shouting commands. Red and blue lights flooded through the windows, illuminating the space like a nightmare come to life. The FBI had been watching. They had been waiting. And Isabella's defiance had given them the time they needed. Lorenzo spun around, his face twisted with rage and disbelief. His men froze, caught between fight and surrender. The warehouse erupted into chaos. Shouted commands, the sound of running feet, the click of handcuffs. Through it all, Isabella stood perfectly still, watching as Lorenzo De Luca, the most feared man in New York City, the man who had controlled her life for 7 years, was surrounded by federal agents, read his rights, and handcuffed. He looked back at her once as they led him away. His expression was complex. Rage, certainly, but also something that might have been respect, or perhaps just the recognition that he had finally encountered something he couldn't control, the courage of someone he had tried to destroy. You did this, he said, not as an accusation but as a statement of fact. Isabella met his gaze steadily. No, Lorenzo, you did this. I just stopped being afraid of you. And as they led him out into the night, toward the police cars and the cameras and the justice he had evaded for so long, Isabella Rossi took her first free breath in 7 years. The federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan stood as a monument to justice, its imposing columns and marble steps weathered by decades of New York winters. On a bright April morning, with cherry blossoms beginning to bloom in nearby parks and the city finally shaking off winter's grip, Isabella Rossi climbed those steps for the last time. 3 months had passed since that night in the Brooklyn warehouse. The trial of Lorenzo De Luca had become a media sensation. Every news outlet in the country covered it. The testimony revealed an empire of corruption that had touched politicians, business leaders, and law enforcement officials. The evidence was overwhelming. Recordings from Marco Benedetti's wire, financial documents tracing decades of money laundering, testimonies from dozens of former associates who had chosen cooperation over loyalty. And at the center of it all, providing key testimony that connected the pieces, was Isabella Rossi. She had spent countless hours with federal prosecutors, translating documents, explaining the coded language Lorenzo had used, providing context that turned fragments of evidence into a comprehensive picture of organized crime. She had testified for 2 full days, facing Lorenzo across the courtroom, speaking the truth she had kept silent for 7 years. It had been terrifying. It had been liberating. It had been necessary. Now, as she entered the courthouse for the sentencing hearing, Isabella felt the weight of those 3 months. The fear hadn't disappeared overnight. She still woke sometimes at 3 in the morning, convinced she heard footsteps in her hallway, certain that one of Lorenzo's remaining loyalists had come for revenge. She still looked over her shoulder on the subway, still felt her heart race when someone unexpected approached her. But she was learning to live with the fear instead of being controlled by it, and that made all the difference. The courtroom was packed with media, law enforcement officials, victims' families, and the curious public who had followed every detail of the trial. Isabella took her seat in the section reserved for witnesses, her hands folded in her lap, her expression calm despite the chaos around her. When Lorenzo was led in, wearing a prison jumpsuit instead of his expensive suits, Isabella felt a complicated surge of emotion. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by incarceration and the loss of his empire, but his eyes were still sharp, still calculating, still dangerous. He looked directly at her as he took his seat, and Isabella held his gaze without flinching. She wasn't the same woman who had trembled at his glances 7 years ago. She wasn't even the same woman who had stood in that warehouse 3 months ago, finding her courage in desperation. She was someone new, someone who had reclaimed herself. The judge entered, and the courtroom fell silent. Judge Margaret Chen was known for her toughness, her fairness, and her intolerance for organized crime. She looked at Lorenzo with an expression that suggested she had seen thousands like him and found them all equally contemptible. The sentencing hearing lasted over an hour. The prosecution presented their recommendations. The defense made their final arguments. Victims' family members stood and spoke about the pain Lorenzo's actions had caused. The father who would never walk his daughter down the aisle, the son who grew up without knowing his mother, the small business owner who had lost everything to Lorenzo's extortion. Isabella listened to each testimony, feeling the weight of her own complicity. She had been a victim, yes, but she had also enabled Lorenzo's crimes through her silence and her work. That was a truth she would carry with her always. Finally, Judge Chen spoke. "Lorenzo De Luca," she began, her voice clear and firm. "You have been found guilty of racketeering, money laundering, conspiracy to commit murder, extortion, and numerous other charges. The evidence presented at this trial paints a picture of a man who built an empire on fear, violence, and the suffering of others. You showed no mercy to your victims. You felt entitled to control, to intimidate, to destroy anyone who stood in your way." Lorenzo's expression didn't change, but Isabella saw his jaw tighten. "The law allows me some discretion in sentencing," Judge Chen continued. "But in this case, the crimes are so extensive, the impact on the community so devastating, that I believe the maximum sentence is not only appropriate but necessary." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the courtroom. "I hereby sentence you to 45 years in federal prison, without the possibility of parole." The courtroom erupted. Media members rushed to report the news. Some people cheered, others gasped. Lorenzo's few remaining supporters shouted protests. But through it all, Isabella sat perfectly still, letting the reality wash over her. It was over. Finally. Truly over. As the guards prepared to lead Lorenzo away, he turned one last time to look at Isabella. And in that moment, something unexpected happened. Lorenzo De Luca, the man who had controlled her life through fear and intimidation, did something she never thought she would see. He nodded at her. Not a nod of surrender, but of acknowledgement. He had finally understood what she had known that night in the warehouse. Fear only has power if you let it control you. The weeks that followed were a blur of new beginnings. Isabella had entered witness protection initially, but after extensive debriefing and evaluation, federal agents determined that with Lorenzo imprisoned and his organization dismantled, she was safe enough to resume a normal life. But what was normal? Isabella had spent 7 years in Lorenzo's orbit, had built her entire adult life around fear and survival. Now, with that gone, she had to discover who she actually was. She started small. She moved out of the apartment Lorenzo had provided, finding a modest studio in Brooklyn with large windows that let in morning light. She changed her phone number. She began seeing a therapist twice a week, working through the trauma and the guilt and the complicated emotions that came with having been both victim and participant in Lorenzo's crimes. She also started volunteering. She found a nonprofit that helped women escape domestic violence and controlling relationships. She translated for immigrants navigating the legal system. She spoke at high schools about the importance of recognizing manipulation and abuse before it became normalized. She was learning to use her voice for good. 6 months after the sentencing, Isabella stood in front of a small audience at a community center in Queens. The room was filled with women who had survived abusive relationships, who had found the courage to leave, who were rebuilding their lives piece by piece. Isabella told them her story. Not all of it. Some details were still protected by federal investigations, but enough. She told them about the gradual loss of self, the normalization of fear, the way control could look like care until you realized you couldn't breathe without permission. And she told them about that night in the warehouse, when she had finally said the words that changed everything. "I'm not afraid of you anymore. I want to be honest with you," Isabella said, her voice steady as she looked at the faces before her. "Finding courage doesn't mean the fear goes away. I'm still afraid sometimes. I still have nightmares. I still look over my shoulder. But I've learned that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision that something else matters more." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "For me, what mattered more was reclaiming myself. I had spent 7 years disappearing, becoming smaller and quieter and more compliant. And one day I realized that if I continued on that path, there would be nothing left of me to save. So I made a choice. I decided that my freedom was worth the risk, that my voice was worth using, that I was worth fighting for." After the talk, a young woman approached her. She couldn't have been more than 25, with dark circles under her eyes and a nervousness that Isabella recognized intimately. "How did you know?" the young woman asked quietly. "How did you know it was time to leave?" Isabella considered the question. It was one she had asked herself many times. "I think," she said slowly, "it's time to leave when you realize that fear of staying has become greater than fear of going. When you understand that the life you're living isn't actually life at all, but just survival. When you catch a glimpse of who you used to be, who you could still be, and you decide that person is worth fighting for." The young woman's eyes filled with tears. "I'm scared." "I know," Isabella said gently. "But you're here. You showed up tonight. That took courage, and courage grows with practice. Every small act of resistance, every tiny boundary you set, every moment you choose yourself, it all adds up. One day you'll look back and realize you've already left. You're already free." 1 year after Lorenzo's sentencing, Isabella received an unexpected letter. It had been forwarded through her lawyer, who had reviewed it carefully for any threats or manipulation before passing it along. The letter was from Lorenzo. Isabella held the envelope for a long time before opening it, her hands steady, but her heart racing. She didn't owe him anything. Not her time, not her attention, certainly not her forgiveness. She could throw this letter away unopened and never think about it again. But curiosity won. She opened it. The letter was brief, written in Lorenzo's precise handwriting. "Isabella, I don't expect forgiveness, and I'm not asking for it. I'm writing because, in the year I've spent in this cell, I've had time to think about the life I built and the people I destroyed in the process. You were right that night. My empire was built on fear, and I wielded it like a weapon without ever considering the cost. I told myself I was powerful, that control was strength, that fear was respect. But when you stood in that warehouse and told me you weren't afraid anymore, I saw something I had never seen before, real strength. Not the manufactured power of threats and violence, but the genuine courage it takes to stand up to someone who has controlled you. I don't know what your life looks tentar novamente t continuer looks like now, but I hope you found the freedom you were searching for. I took that from you for 7 years. I can never give that time back. This isn't an apology. Words on paper can't undo what I did. But I want you to know that in my entire life, you're the only person who truly defeated me. Not the FBI. Not the prosecutors. You. Because you took back the one thing I thought I could always control. Your fear. Whatever life you build from here, I hope it's everything you deserve. Lorenzo Isabella read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. This wasn't about Lorenzo seeking redemption or her providing closure. It was simply acknowledgement that she had won, that she had survived, that she had transformed herself from victim to survivor to something even more powerful, a free woman who knew her own strength. 2 years after that night in the warehouse, on a crisp October afternoon when the leaves in Central Park blazed gold and crimson, Isabella sat on a bench watching children play. She had just finished meeting with her publisher. Yes, her publisher. She had written a book about recognizing and escaping controlling relationships, about the psychology of fear, about reclaiming your voice after years of silence. It would be published in 6 months, and she hoped it would help people who were still living in the shadows she had escaped. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marco Benedetti. After serving a reduced sentence for his cooperation with federal authorities, Marco had been released and was now working with law enforcement to help dismantle other criminal organizations. He and Isabella had formed an unlikely friendship, bonded by their shared experience of breaking free from Lorenzo's world. The text was simple. Coffee next week? Want to hear about the book progress? Isabella smiled and typed back, definitely. Tuesday at 2. As she put her phone away, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The 7 years of fear and silence. The moment of courage in that warehouse. The difficult months of testimony and healing. The slow, challenging work of rebuilding herself. People often asked her if she regretted those 7 years, if she wished she had found her courage sooner. The answer was complicated. Yes, she wished she hadn't lost so much time to fear, but she also understood that courage isn't always immediate. Sometimes it builds slowly, like water wearing away stone. Sometimes you need to survive before you can fight. Sometimes the journey to freedom is long and painful and messy. What mattered wasn't how long it took. What mattered was that she had finally arrived. Isabella thought about the young woman from the community center who had asked how to know when it was time to leave. She had seen that woman again a few months later, stronger, clearer, taking her first steps toward independence. Isabella had felt a surge of hope and pride that she was able to help someone else find their way out of the darkness. That's what she wanted her legacy to be. Not the woman who had worked for a mafia boss. Not even the woman who had helped bring him down. But the woman who had reclaimed herself and then reached back to help others do the same. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the park, Isabella stood and began walking home to her Brooklyn apartment. She had plans tonight. Dinner with friends, people she had met through her volunteer work, people who knew her as Isabella the advocate, the survivor, the author, not Isabella the frightened translator who had lost herself in someone else's shadow. She walked with her head up, her stride confident, her eyes clear. The city moved around her in its endless rhythm. Millions of people living their lives, facing their own battles, finding their own courage. And Isabella Rossi, who had once believed she would never be free, who had spent 7 years controlled by fear, who had found the strength to look into the eyes of the man who terrified her and say, "I'm not afraid of you anymore." She was finally, completely, beautifully free. The price of that freedom had been high. It had cost her 7 years. Countless sleepless nights, the trauma she would carry forever, and the innocence she could never reclaim. But it had also given her something invaluable. Herself. And that, she had learned, was worth everything. Lorenzo De Luca remains in federal prison where he will spend the rest of his life. His empire was completely dismantled, with over 50 associates convicted and hundreds of millions in assets seized. The neighborhoods he once controlled with fear are slowly healing, reclaiming their streets and their dignity. Marco Benedetti continues to work with federal authorities, using his insider knowledge to help dismantle organized crime networks. He has publicly spoken about the courage it took to become an informant and the relief of finally being free from a life of violence and crime. And Isabella Rossi? She published her book, Reclaiming Your Voice, A Journey from Fear to Freedom, which became a bestseller and has helped thousands of people recognize and escape controlling relationships. She speaks regularly at conferences, universities, and community centers. She has started a nonprofit organization that provides resources and support for people leaving situations of coercion and control. She never married, never had children, but she built a life rich with purpose, connection, and meaning. She surrounded herself with people who valued her strength, her intelligence, and her compassion. She traveled to places Lorenzo had never allowed her to go. She made decisions based on her own desires, not someone else's demands. Most importantly, she never again lived in fear. Isabella's story reminds us that courage isn't about never being afraid. It's about facing that fear and choosing something greater, your dignity, your freedom, your very self. It shows us that control can disguise itself as care, that abuse isn't always loud and obvious, and that the first step to freedom is often just saying no when every instinct screams at you to comply. Her story also teaches us that it's never too late to reclaim yourself. Whether you've been trapped for 7 years or 7 months or 7 days, the moment you decide that your freedom matters more than your fear is the moment everything begins to change. Isabella faced one of the most dangerous men in New York City and told him she wasn't afraid anymore. And in doing so, she discovered something that no amount of power or money or control could ever take away: her own unbreakable strength. If you're living in fear today, if you're in a relationship or situation where someone else controls your choices and silences your voice, please know this: you have more strength than you realize. You deserve freedom. You deserve to live without fear. And when you're ready, not when someone else tells you to be ready, but when you are ready, you will find the courage to say those powerful words: "I'm not afraid of you anymore." And that will be the beginning of everything. Thank you for joining us on this powerful journey of courage, survival, and freedom. Isabella's story shows us that even in our darkest moments, we have the power to reclaim ourselves. If this story moved you, touched your heart, or inspired you, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our next incredible true-to-life narrative. We share stories of real human courage, resilience, and transformation, stories that remind us of the strength we all carry within. Leave a comment below telling us what this story meant to you. Have you ever had to find the courage to stand up to someone who controlled you? What gave you the strength to say, "I'm not afraid anymore"? Your story might inspire someone else who needs to hear it. Share this video with someone who needs to hear Isabella's message. You never know who might be living in silence, waiting for a sign that freedom is possible. And remember, courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision that something else matters more. Until next time, stay strong, stay courageous, and never forget your own worth. Subscribe, share, and keep believing in the power of the human spirit.